going to get started. My name is Lynn Brown. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council with Greater Reading, and thanks for being here so much. I'd like to kick off our meeting with introducing our sponsors today, which is the WISE Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Committee. And I'm going to ask Deb Zabonik to come up here, and we'd like to present her with a certificate. And she'd like to introduce some very special international guests we have at our front table.
Thank you, Lynn. Very nice. We'll add this to our collection in the International Room at the YMCA. Thank you. I'd like to ask the YMCA International staff and folks to raise your hands. We've got lots of people here from the YMCA. The YMCA of Reading and Berks County, our DIG committee, which stands for Diversity, Inclusion, and Global, previously known as something much simpler, the International Committee, is proud to bring you this program about Syria today because we know we have a commitment to global peoples, friends, and partners. If you take a minute to look at our brochure on the table, you'll see pictures and information about YMCA friends and activities that relate to the international commitment that we have here in Berks County as well as internationally. We strive to educate and improve the global understanding each year with youth and adult exchanges and support to our partner branches and neighbor YMCAs such as the South Mountain YMCA up in Wardersville. But in this day and age, it is vital that we further the YMCA mission here and abroad by improving international peace and understanding throughout the world, where the YMCA has a presence in 120 countries. If you would like to assist the YMCA of Reading and Berks County in this mission, please see one of us at one of the tables up here, and join us in reaching out to many here in Berks County, at South Mountain YMCA camps, friends and members in the Berks County area, and our German and Russian YMCA partners. Our DIG committee is committed to our partner YMCAs and dear friends from the YMCA of Hanover, Germany, where we've been partners for over 65 years, and a special friendship and partnership for 23 years with the YMCA of Russia, specifically with the YMCA in Ivanovo, Russia. We are fortunate today to have two of these friends from Russia with us. I'd like to introduce Alexei Kosakov, he's going to wave to you, the Executive Director of the YMCA of Russia, and Anastasia Sayakova. I don't think I did very well on that. The Director of Ivanovo, Russia YMCA. So they forgave me for saying their names wrong, but we think of them as Nastya and Alexei, and we are delighted to have them here. I hope after the time today you'll come up front and perhaps speak with them because they have a lot to share, and it's so much easier one-on-one. But I am going to pass the microphone to Alexei so he can give a few words to you. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Debbie. Dear friends, it's a great privilege to be here with you today. It's a great joy for us to see that your community is coming together and sharing and learning about the world. And this is, I agree with Debbie, this is one of the great things YMCAs do worldwide. They help to bring people, especially young people and kids, together and meet each other and learn each other and build bridges of friendships and get rid of stereotypes and prejudices. And I think this is one of the most important programs for the worldwide YMCA today, especially if we look at the many crazy things that happen on the political level. I know everybody knows what we're talking about. So YMCA is this great non-political platform that really helps to bring people together. And we are very thankful to our partners in the Reading and Berks YMCA and our good friends in the South Mountain YMCA for doing it over 20 years, and we are committed to do it many years too. Thank you.
Our speaker today is Ambassador Fred Hof. His topic is Syria, Why It Matters and What Can Be Done. Fred has been a soldier, diplomat, CEO, author, and the director of the Atlantic County's Center for the Middle East. He's currently on the faculty at Bard College and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Harari Center of the Middle East. He published works that have focused on Arab-Israeli boundary issues and water disputes and the Syrian crisis. He received his rank of ambassador in 2012 while serving as an advisor to the Secretary of State on the political transitions in Syria. We had a wonderful meeting with him today at a local high school in Fleetwood, where about 200 students had the benefit of hearing him talk about this important subject. So with that, Ambassador Hof, we're going to turn it over to you at the podium.
Well, Lynn, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. Am I projecting sufficiently to the back of the room there? Can everybody hear me? Okay. One thing that gives me particular pleasure is seeing that all of you, or most of you certainly, have had a chance to have something to eat. Because my topic is not particularly an appetizer one. Better to eat first and then listen to me when it comes to Syria. Syria actually is a country that started to be an important part of my life when I was all of 16 years old. When I went off to Damascus during the summer between my junior and senior years of high school as an American Field Service exchange student. I lived with a Syrian family. I won lifelong Syrian friends and learned a lot about a country that had, even back then, for a century at least, sent its best and brightest to the United States. 9 years ago, another Arab American, a Lebanese, by the name of George Mitchell, former majority leader of the United States Senate, invited me to serve as one of his deputies in the State Department. He'd just been appointed Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. This is something that President Obama did, I think, within 48 or 72 hours of being inaugurated. My job was to try to find a way to Israeli-Syrian peace. Senator Mitchell concentrated on Palestinians and Israelis. I focused on Israelis and Syrians. By early 2011, I was, believe it or not, making real progress on this. I was shuttling back and forth very quietly. None of it leaked. None of it ended up in the press. Shuttling back and forth between Damascus and Jerusalem. When for reasons I still don't understand 100%, the Syrian leader with whom I was negotiating, a person I had found very businesslike, very direct, decided to use lethal violence against Syrian citizens peacefully protesting police brutality. This decision destroyed, unfortunately, a very promising mediation. 7.5 years later, that fateful decision has all but destroyed Syria, a country that is absolutely filled with decent, talented, entrepreneurial, and generous people. I mention this history, personal and professional, so I can admit something up front. My interest in Syria and my sense of its importance is somewhat unusual. It's shared by very few, frankly speaking, of my fellow Americans. Even here at the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, I suspect that many of you, listening politely and even attentively to my words, harbor a deep suspicion that at the end of the day, no matter what happens in Syria, no matter how horrible, it matters not much to the lives of Americans or the security of the United States. I get this, totally. It neither frustrates me nor angers me. I think it's fully understandable. I'm old enough to remember American leaders claiming that our security and the security of the world hinged on the future of Vietnam. An argument that put me in that country for a year as an Army lieutenant and cost the lives of over 58,000 of our countrymen. Most of us are old enough to remember being assured that the people of Iraq would welcome our invasion, treat us as heroes, and help us spread democracy from Iraq to Iran and beyond. Given Vietnam, given Iraq, and other places where Americans have been placed in harm's way for reasons that are at best unclear, it surprises me not at all that most Americans will look at Syria as a mess well worth avoiding. A humanitarian and political abomination for sure, but someone else's problem, not ours. I understand that point of view, and I respect it. If I agreed with it, I'd have to plead guilty to having wasted the last 10 years of my life. Once my peace mission came to an end in the spring of 2011, I agreed, against my better judgment, to stay on for a while in the State Department. I had been recruited initially from the private sector. I agreed to stay on in the State Department as an advisor on Syria to the Secretary of State. I left government in late 2012 and became a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a Washington, D.C. think tank, where I continued to focus on Syria and related problems. Eventually, I would lead the Council's Middle East Center, and still paying a lot of attention to Syria. I've been at Bard College in upstate New York only since this past summer, but Syria remains very much on my mind, as my presence before you today testifies. So I'm not prepared, not yet anyway, to enter a guilty plea for time wasting, and I'd like to explain why. The Syrian uprising began right around St. Patrick's Day, March 2011. It was part of a broader Arab uprising sweeping the Middle East at the time. Syrians, mainly young people, along with their counterparts in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere, came out into the streets peacefully to shout some version of enough. Enough with corrupt, incompetent, and self-enriching family-based regimes. Enough with political criminals presiding over rising unemployment and underemployment. Enough with leaders and entourages unable or unwilling to treat people with justice and dignity. Peaceful protesters were demanding a New Deal. Political systems deriving their power not from dictates on high, but from the consent of the governed. President Barack Obama seemed to appreciate why these uprisings actually did matter for American security. He knew that political systems solidly rooted in the consent of the governed would close the Arab world to the kinds of violent extremists who pulled off 9/11. He saw those extremists as vacuum fillers, as violent Islamists ready and willing to fill voids of governing illegitimacy. Those voids would open when authoritarian regimes shut down peaceful dissent and channeled all opposition into some combination of sullen resignation and armed resistance. Obama sensed that for those dictators to hang on, they'd have to kill a lot of people and open doors to political Islamists of the violent, terrorist, Al-Qaeda variety. He knew that these terrorists would proclaim their hatred not only of these corrupt regimes, but of a United States that often had close relationships with some of those regimes. The nervous dictators who were faced with those protests in 2011, something that's popularly called the Arab Spring, told a different story. They described the protesters as the terrorists and themselves as the only ones standing between stability and complete chaos. But in Egypt, the army refused to fire on demonstrators. And President Mubarak, who had been in office for a long, long time, went down. In Tunisia, the army declined to shoot protesters. And President Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia in exile. In Yemen, President Saleh was willing to do anything to stay in power, but a grant of legal immunity persuaded him to step down. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi was prepared to commit mass murder, but NATO intervention helped to bring him down. In Syria, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the person with whom I was negotiating in good faith, would shoot and imprison protesters. But more importantly, the Syrian government would release violent Islamist criminals from its prisons to pollute a nationalistic, non-sectarian opposition. It wanted to solidify its own base in Syrian minorities and to militarize an uprising it was afraid it would lose if the uprising were allowed to stay peaceful. It was and continues to be a very successful, if cynical, and bloody-minded survival strategy. Over the past 7.5 years, Syria has resembled the victim in Murder on the Orient Express. The Assad regime planned and orchestrated the killing for the simplest of motives, to cling to power at any cost. It is overwhelmingly at fault, though not alone, for a cavalcade of truly depressing statistics. Upwards of 500,000 people, mainly civilians, dead. More than half of a pre-war population of 23 million people displaced from their homes, both internally and as refugees. Tens of thousands of people illegally detained and subject to torture, rape, starvation, and execution. Hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in starvation and medical sieges, and countless defenseless civilians, many of them children, permanently traumatized by a regime military strategy that has focused relentlessly on mass civilian homicide. A state terror campaign trying to separate rebels from their civilian supporters. A civilian-centric campaign that has used every weapon at the disposal of the Syrian state, including chemicals. But many knives were plunged into this corpse. Taking advantage of the regime's disappearance from eastern Syria, ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, filled the vacuum. It set up shop in the Syrian city of Raqqa and invaded Iraq in 2014. Then it conducted bloody, spectacular terrorist operations in Paris, Brussels, and several places in Turkey. ISIL and the Assad regime have had mainly, not all the time, but mainly, a live and let live relationship. ISIL's flamboyant brutality, burning people alive in cages, cutting throats. This brutality has enabled Assad to tout himself as the civilized alternative. And Assad's brutality has given ISIL a recruiting tool of tremendous value in the Sunni Arab world. It's been a truly symbiotic relationship. For Americans, however, ISIL's 2014 invasion of Iraq brought U.S. troops back into Mesopotamia and put American boots on the ground in eastern Syria itself. They're still there, in both places. Our decision to use a Syrian Kurdish militia as our ground combat force against ISIL has contributed to a crisis in our relationship with Turkey, a NATO ally. That decision to use a local militia instead of using a professional ground force coalition of the willing to kill ISIL in Syria has lengthened the war, magnified the damage to civilians and property, and it gave ISIL the time to plan and execute bloody terror operations in Paris, Brussels, and elsewhere. Sadly, some of the knives plunged into the corpse were in the hands of American partners and allies. I mentioned that the initial peaceful phase of the Syrian uprising was non-sectarian. It was Syrian nationalist. Assad emptied, as I mentioned, the jails of violent Islamists to change the nature of the uprising, to make it something he might be able to suppress and defeat. As Washington tried to look the other way and keep this Syrian mess at arm's length, regional actors, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and others, poured arms and money into anti-regime militias they each hoped to control. These militias were Islamist in orientation, Sunni Muslim to be specific, and they were more or less, sometimes less, reliable clients of the countries paying their salaries and giving them weapons. Unfortunately, these donor countries were united only by a profound dislike for the Assad regime. They had little regard or respect for Syria or Syrians per se. The armed elements they supported sometimes fought effectively, but they played into the hands of Bashar al-Assad and his regime. Many of these militias engaged in common crime, all to the delight of the Assad regime in Damascus. Private Arab funders, mainly Kuwaitis, subsidized al-Qaeda in Syria. All of this was done to try to unseat Assad, who was widely portrayed as an Alawite mass murderer of Muslims. All of it played directly into Assad's survival strategy. These organizations scared Syrian minorities, and even a sizable minority of Syrian Sunni Muslims. The growing sectarian nature of the struggle for Syria ultimately enabled Assad to call on Iran and later Russia to intervene militarily to save a regime whose own military was pretty good at killing civilians, but not much else. Now I know what many of you are thinking at this point. This is a sad story. Indeed, it's an outrage. But why does any of this matter to the United States? Paraphrasing the 2013 words of a senior official of the Obama administration to some congressional staffers, what's wrong with standing aside and watching as a bunch of bad actors slaughter one another? Set aside the humanitarian implications for defenseless civilians of that official's deep dive into bottomless cynicism. Still, there's a question. What does any of it really matter to the United States? My concern as an American, and I'm trying hard to discount my own almost lifelong interest in Syria, is that a ruined Syria, particularly one in the hands of the Assad regime and its entourage, will continue to hemorrhage desperate human beings and host Islamist terrorists for as far as the eye can see. The Assad regime has proven over the past 7.5 years it cannot govern without state terror. The Assad regime cannot oversee the country's physical reconstruction without lining its pockets. The Assad regime cannot exist without relying on Iranian-commanded Shia foreign fighters from Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Even before the uprising, many Syrians were eager to get out, searching for opportunities their own officials reserved for themselves, their families, and their supporters. With the Assad regime propped up externally, the only people other than the regime and its external supporters who will see the country as a profit center will be violent Islamists seeking again to fill vacuums of governing legitimacy. The prospective emptying of Syria under these conditions should matter to us. In 2015, a migratory wave, 60% of it, more or less, Syrian, swept over Western Europe. We can, if we wish, declare ourselves uninterested in the resulting growth of political nativism in Europe. We can, if we wish, deny the existence of a straight line between the 2015 migrant crisis and Brexit. We can, if we wish, ignore the effects of that crisis on European unity more broadly. Indeed, we can, if we wish, decide that European unity and the political survival of effective European leaders are of no consequence to the United States. This is the policy that some would want us to adopt, particularly those who continue to support the Assad regime. Many Americans, however, will not be swayed by arguments centered on the well-being of allies. Some of our countrymen, far short of a minority, I would hope, but some, I suspect, would take in stride even the disestablishment of NATO and the liquidation of American mutual defense commitments. Few Americans, I think, lose much sleep over challenges to European unity. My own view is that we need healthy, politically stable allies, and this is one reason why Syria matters. My own view is that when the United States elects to stand aside and exact no price of a government bent on subjecting its citizenry to mass murder, the political consequences can leapfrog the humanitarian results. Not only will people in various parts of the world decide on the basis of American passivity, for example, a huge gap between declaring a red line and not enforcing it, that the maps of Europe and elsewhere can be changed with impunity, but other beleaguered leaders around the world will conclude that mass homicide is the free ticket to political survival. The bottom line is that what's happened in Syria has not stayed in Syria. I admit that I have a special interest in the humanitarian consequences of all of this for Syrians. But Stalin may have been right when he said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 dead is a statistic." We Americans were momentarily interested when we saw the body of that little boy washed up on a Turkish beach. But that passed. If I'm to convince any American that Syria matters, it must be on some basis other than allies and humanitarianism. Syria, in my view, should matter most to Americans because of its potential for becoming an incubator and a base for transnational terrorism. An ungoverned space where Iranian-commanded foreign fighters tried desperately to force Assad, their client and their servant, on a country that is 2/3 Sunni Muslim. A country that simply cannot attract significant international funding for reconstruction so long as the Assad regime stands ready to steal whatever it can. Syria is, in short, the prototype for violent illegitimacy producing a vacuum to be filled by extremist alternatives to official violence, terror, and kleptocracy. We have, and we're very fortunate in this respect, we have in our country excellent people and abundant resources protecting us against terrorist threats from abroad. But no one, not the FBI, not the Department of Homeland Security, not the TSA, would claim that we are immune from something replicating the impact of 9/11. If the failed state that is Syria becomes the terrorism incubator I fear it may become, we will not be able to secure our country through a domestic defense alone. If we really think that we can defend ourselves adequately without spending quality time monitoring Syria and working for a civilized political outcome, we'll probably act as if what happens in Syria just doesn't matter. And I'm afraid we'll simply find out the hard way that it does matter. Please note that I have not mentioned the word Israel until now. I've not made the argument that Iran's presence in Syria and the existence of its Lebanese subsidiary, Hezbollah, presents sizable threats to Israel. But I'm willing to assume that many Americans are not a whole lot more interested in Israel than they are in NATO, the UK, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, the list goes on. Perhaps not interested enough to support an American commitment. Certainly not important enough to put quality time and effort into Syria. If I'm going to succeed in convincing many of my fellow citizens that Syria matters, I suspect it will be the terrorism incubator argument that wins. We have, after all, been fighting ISIL in eastern Syria longer than we fought in World War II. Assad's strongest supporters, Iran and its Lebanese franchise, Hezbollah, have long and notorious histories in international terrorism. In my mind, however, the biggest threat would be the resurrection in Syria of extremist Islamism of the Al-Qaeda variety in response to Iran's extremist Islamism of the Shia variety. It is precisely this threat that seems to have convinced a very skeptical President Trump not to leave Syria in the next 20 minutes. I don't doubt that President Trump, on the basis of his own instincts, on the basis of things he said publicly in the past, would have no problem with a very early exit from Syria, an exit that would leave the country in the hands of Iran and Assad, with the support, of course, of the Russian Federation. But administration senior officials seem to have convinced the president that this would not be a wise course of action, that even if we succeed in the coming months in finally eliminating ISIL militarily, it or something like it would arise again if lawless, undisciplined Iranian-led militiamen were turned loose on populations recently liberated from ISIL. Sealing the victory over Sunni Islamist extremism in Syria means keeping it dead. This will be difficult to do if Shia Islamist extremism is permitted to run roughshod over liberated areas in the east or over Turkish-controlled areas